tourism is growing at 10% per year. Up to 300 people visit this small outer barrier reef each day. If you've ever wanted to travel back through time, back to the days when the world was young, back before people walked the earth, back to when the tropics were joined by a single sea, there is a simple way to do it. Go for a dive on a coral reef. It's midnight on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. A diver has entered a timeless landscape. A gigantic limestone city built by colonies of some of the planet's oldest and smallest life forms. For perhaps 500 million years, the world's tropical oceans have been home to different kinds of reef-building corals. For at least the last 50 million years, you could have swum through the sandy streets of coral reefs that look just like this, and met the same inhabitants. Only recently have we begun to fully understand this seascape of the past. Only now are we becoming aware of the damage we are doing. Humanity has entered the coral realm with the technology to begin to unravel the mysteries of this submarine metropolis. In the last few decades, we've discovered the intricate workings of the coral architects, their secret sex life, and the archives locked away in limestone vaults. Archives that can tell us so much about climatic change. Nowhere has science exposed more than in these warm waters of northern Australia. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest construction built by any living thing on Earth. 2,500 kilometers of individual reefs and islands stretching the distance from London to Istanbul. Together, this coral labyrinth forms perhaps the most impressive reef system the world has ever seen. In its depths lie the secrets of the past and a key to the future. "50 million years ago, northern Italy was still underwater. Dinosaurs had only recently left the planet. These mist-shrouded hills near the village of Bolca were mud at the bottom of a warm tropical sea. Coral islands flourished nearby. The search for the origin of the modern coral reef has brought biologist David Bellwood to this fossil mine from the other side of the world.
This is excellent. That's wonderful.
Sì, perfetto. Sì.
Perfect preservation. This is excellent.
Perfettamente i denti.
Are the
denti,
teeth?
yeah.
Yeah?
In these rocks lie the ancestors of the fish he studies alive on the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay, the strong teeth shows that. This is wonderful.
If we look at reefs today, what we're looking at is not a final product of many millions of years of evolution. We're looking at something which is actually quite ancient. In effect, every fish on the reef is a living fossil because we can find almost exactly the same thing here in terms of the taxa, that's the families present, and also in terms of their morphological development. The things in the deposits here are almost indistinguishable from those we find on reefs today.
"50 million years later, the living relatives of these fossils still swim the Pacific. In no other environment on Earth, it seems, has daily life remained so much the same for so long. The fish are so miraculously well preserved that some even boast the ghostly spots of ancient color patterns. The fossils of Bulka cast a new light on our notion of the fragile coral reef, a glimpse of an environment that until now has survived the tests of time.
Color patterns are the same, morphological structures are virtually the same, taxonomic structure of the assemblage is much the same. There is an amazing amount of continuity. These things evolved, and having evolved, they remain virtually unchanged.
Unlike land animals, the creatures of the reef are not trapped when climates change or continents drift. They've always had somewhere to go, the warm, clear shallows of the tropics. Nowhere else in the sea can you find a greater diversity of life. Hundreds of species of coral, thousands of species of fish, tens of thousands of other life forms, all reliant on each other for survival. Surprisingly, this whole carnival of life depends on the thinnest veneer of mucousy slime on the outside of the stony coral skeleton. This is the delicate tissue of the tiny coral animal, the polyp. Hundreds of thousands of polyps can make up each coral colony. But the coral of a coral reef isn't all animal. The only way it can get the energy to build such massive limestone structures is to harness the sun. And to do that, it needs to be part plant.
A reef really is a plant. The animals which build reefs are the corals, but the things which make it possible for them to build reefs are the algae, little unicellular algae that live inside the coral tissue. So you've got these animals, and inside the cells of the animal are algae, and those algae are photosynthesizing, and they're providing to the animal the products of photosynthesis. So they're really, it's like having a cow which doesn't have to graze because it's got the algae underneath its skin. The corals are much the same. They're able to sit there and feed just by absorbing the sunlight.
Dave Barnes has spent his career spying on the sunbathing habits of coral. As his purpose-built machine drifts over the reef, it interrogates the seawater. The temperature, pH levels, how much oxygen, how much light. The water records what the coral below is doing to it, how the raw materials of life are turned into a mountain of limestone.
The rate at which this is producing material, the rate at which it's photosynthesizing here underneath us now is equivalent to a cane field, a well-fertilized, well-watered cane field. The rate of productivity, the natural rate of productivity of a reef is just enormous. It's fantastic.
Each year, a healthy reef can add an astounding 5,000 tons of new architecture to every square kilometre of this city beneath the sea. A miracle, given that these clear waters are the equivalent of a marine desert. Like rainforests, reefs are masterfully efficient at cycling the meagre nutrients that wash in from the open ocean. But after 50 million years of perfection, a biological latecomer has thrown all this submarine magic into jeopardy. In the last 50 years, humanity has propelled an assault on the world's coral citadels that has spread far wider and far deeper than ever before in their ancient history. This Filipino fisherman relies on his reef for survival. He's one of millions, which means the easiest way for him to catch the few small fish left is to quite literally blast his reef to bits. It's illegal, of course, but it's a scene repeated throughout Southeast Asia. Throughout much of this part of the world, including the Philippines, the shelves of the coral supermarket are being stripped bare. The human invasion of the coral seas is relentless and overwhelming. Demand is so intense that reef flats are scoured by torchlight.
The population of this country is rapidly approaching 68 million at this time. In 32 years' time, there'll be twice as many people in this country, probably more than twice as many people fishing the reefs. And the resources are under a great deal of strain right now.
For the last decade, fish biologist Gary Russ has split his research between Australia and the Philippines.
My research has been essentially monitoring reef fish populations inside and outside marine parks using a technique of underwater visual sensors. I've seen, in my 10 years of research here, reefs literally devastated, going from very nice reefs to almost marine deserts due to overfishing, pollution, deforestation, all of the major problems that occur in this country.
Some of the pressure comes from far away. These boys are collecting for the international aquarium trade. Fish are flushed from their hiding holes in a cyanide-induced coma. Once caught, they'll be battling simply to reach their destination alive. Every year, countless millions of reef creatures, fish, seashells and coral are plucked from the water and eaten or exported. This is Filipino coral, sold as a souvenir of a trip to the Florida Keys. Such a sale of Florida coral is protected by United States law. The Florida Keys are some of the most strictly policed coral waters in the world.
Hey guys, how's the diving today? Good. Are you all from down here?
I live down here.
You live down here?
Yeah.
We ever given you an information packet? Might help you, give you some other ideas if you're planning on doing any more diving.
Thanks a lot.
Y'all have a good day.
Bye-bye.
It was here, in John Pennekamp State Park, that one of the world's first coral reef sanctuaries was declared as far back as 1960. But it seems devotion alone may not be enough to protect America's reefs. Even in this most developed of nations, the hand of man seems to be at work beneath the sea. 150 kilometers to the south, reefs near Key West are turning into slime-covered wastelands, and no one is too sure why.
We have experts that told us 2 years ago we have 10 years, and everyone took that, as a big shock. In 1 decade we'll lose our coral reefs. So we began a photo monitoring program where we just do this low-key monitoring of coral head, to take the same picture of the same coral heads, month after month. And the decline is so rapid that I would say that we don't have 10 years left of these reefs. We maybe have 5 left of these reefs.
In Jamaica, reefs have lost 80% of their corals in a decade. With a plague wiping out sea urchins and buffeted by hurricanes, the corals have been overtaken by algae. In Tahiti, corals have responded to a local rise in water temperature by expelling their symbiotic algae. It's the 4th such bleaching event in 10 years. The list goes on. Perhaps all we are seeing are localized hiccups of little consequence in the long-term history of coral reefs. But perhaps all the planet's little hiccups are starting to join up. Today, Australia's Great Barrier Reef stands as a beacon of hope in the global sea of coral despair. But only just.
My endeavour as the Minister for Mines is to encourage oil exploration in Queensland onshore and offshore.
In the 1960s and 70s, talk of oil mining prompted a fight for the reef's future. With the battle won in the reef's favour, 95% of the reef has now been declared a marine park. This is an area of coral sea floor larger than the United Kingdom, both protected and still relatively pristine. It's now zoned for uses like tourism, fishing and marine research. But even while the park was being established, this vast natural laboratory was undergoing its first big experiment.
This Cairns diver did battle with the crown of thorns for nearly a year. He alone brought up over 26,000 of them.
Millions of crown of thorns starfish had appeared out of nowhere, infesting one reef after another, sucking the flesh of the living coral clean. No one knew for sure where they'd come from, nor whether this was a plague that should be interfered with.
What's needed, it seems, is nothing short of a crash program of scientific research. For if it is too late, the Great Barrier Reef won't be great anymore. Much, if not most of it, will no longer exist, except as a stark reminder of its former glory.
Three decades after they first appeared, both the Crown of Thorns and the Great Barrier Reef are still with us. We now know the starfish have been around for perhaps 1 million years, that each female can produce 100 million larvae in a spawning season, and that these drift from reef to reef on prevailing currents. We know that when they settle, the young eat algae before changing their diet to living coral. And we know that a second outbreak in the 1980s affected 1 reef in 5, all of which should recover given time. But the fundamental question of what causes starfish plagues remains unanswered.
Reefs are seen to be one of the most complex ecosystems in the world today. And in order to understand the importance of crown of thorns starfish in reefs, you have to understand the system. And so it's not just a matter of going in there and teasing apart 1 or 2 small problems. You're dealing with a range of complexity.
When you begin to unravel 50 million years of complexity, you should expect a few surprises. For example, the Great Barrier Reef is only about 500,000 years old, and it's only existed in its present form since the last ice age.
360 different types of coal you'll see here.
10,000 years ago, these tourists could have walked this same spot. It would have been a dry, tree-covered hill near the shore of an ice age coral sea. As the ice caps melted, the rising seas brought coral larvae from deeper water, and construction of these coral cities began. Today, glass-bottomed boats glide over the coral equivalent of a skyscraper. It's a massive coral called Porites. Porites corals store away their entire life history in their skeleton. For scientists probing the growth of today's reefs, an X-ray of a slice of Porites boulder reveals a unique medical record.
So we've got this light line coming each year after the end of this dark band, which is the wet season.
Each pair of light and dark bands in this X-ray represents a year in the life of this coral. A dense band in winter and a less dense band during the rapid growth of summer. Dave Barnes can read environmental history of this individual as others read the passage of seasons in the rings of a tree.
73. So this coral started growing about 1973.
But there are other, even more useful environmental signals hidden in these seasonal bands. Every wet season, rain falling on the mainland washes all manner of substances out to sea. At least one of these substances, a humic acid from rotting vegetation, is taken up by coral. The chance discovery by Peter Eisdale that this humic acid glowed under ultraviolet light has led to a whole new branch of tropical climatology.
We can see the intense band here in 1958, which was a fairly large wet season, and so on up to 1968, which was a similar wet season. But in 1969, there's no humic acid band fluorescing, showing the river hardly flowed in that year. Moving up to 1972, we can see the double peak in the flow of the river that year, 2 months apart, and then the very big flood in 1974, which affected most of Queensland.
These bands can be analysed with an accuracy of at least a month. Their thickness and intensity has proved to be an almost perfect match with instrument records of river flow kept for the last 80 years. With this as a calibration, the team have been able to push way back into the unrecorded past.
Yeah, roger. Sharpie's got it on the bow door now, coming down. Over.
Okay. Roger, just steady as she goes.
Really immense Porites colonies can grow as large as houses. Some may grow for more than 1,000 years. This one is relatively small, only about 400 years old. A few hours drilling will tap deep into the coral's historical archives. With massive corals like this growing in tropical oceans worldwide, the implications for understanding changing patterns in the atmosphere above is enormous. The core is retrieved in century-long chunks. When drilling is complete, a concrete bung plugs the hole and the coral quickly seals it over.
This is the coral core we drilled today from the massive living coral on the Great Barrier Reef, and it contains quite a remarkable record of the environment of this place for the last 350 or so years. Now we're looking at the beginning of its growth back in the, say, around 1600 period, and in fact it was about 1 metre high by the time James Cook arrived in these waters in 1770. And it's been laying down about 1 centimetre a year, year by year, recording all sorts of chemical signals which tell us what the climate or what the weather was like in those particular years. And so on through the 1800s, and we know from this core and from other ones that the 1870s to the present were quite a wet period, whereas when Cook arrived, or at least the 100 years after Cook arrived, was quite a dry period, and we can tell that by looking in these coral cores. And so we end up with, at about 1 centimetre a year, this length encompassing our lifetimes, right up to the living polyp today.
Not only do we know how old this coral is and how much rainfall occurred in its lifetime, in the last 15 years we've discovered exactly what its parents were up to on a warm spring night 350 years ago.
Our knowledge about corals and coral reefs has changed quite dramatically in the past 15 years. 15 years ago, the textbooks would have said that most corals release live young and that they would settle fairly close to the parents.
In fact, this wasn't the case at all. Instead of releasing larvae, the majority of corals, well over 100 species, were spawning bundles of eggs and sperm which float away before fertilizing. More significantly, they all seemed to be doing it at the same time, the week after the full moon in late spring. For those few nights each year, the Great Barrier Reef becomes a blizzard of sex.
When I first saw mass spawning underwater, it was mind-blowing. It's something that you don't expect from looking at a little coral which looks very much like a rock. To a lot of people, I'm sure they don't think that it's living. But here was living proof that these things are animals. They release massive amounts of eggs and sperm. It's just like sitting inside the most amazing snowstorm with everything rising up around you. Everywhere you look throughout the water column, you see masses of eggs rising up to the surface. If all the eggs and sperm are ending up on the surface, they're subjected to wind-driven currents. So that means that wherever the winds and the currents are going, those larvae are going to end up. And what we have found that a very high proportion of the larvae end up at a reef down current. So what that means is that you can't manage a single reef on its own. You have to manage larger units of reefs. It makes no sense to look at a reef in isolation if all its juvenile corals are going to end up on another reef.
With a knowledge of tides and currents, it becomes possible to suggest which reefs tend to be a source of coral larvae and which tend to become a sink. Source reefs can then be given greater protection. The same holds true for the wealth of other life that coral reefs harbour. But on most reefs in Southeast Asia today, currents are more likely to bring fresh supplies of plastic bags than the fish larvae the countries so desperately need. Big adult fish are the first to vanish when a reef is a source of subsistence rather than a national treasure. This fisherman is after small plankton-eating fish called fusiliers. The tiny hook he needs is disguised in a fishy paste pressed to a rock. With few fish left that are easy to trap, net or bait, these plankton eaters now make up a significant portion of the Philippines' catch.
We are a fish-eating people. 50 to 60% of our diet is fish. And we cannot just do without the fish. And therefore, we have to protect what remains of our reef systems by way of setting up sanctuaries.
In the early 1980s, Alcala and staff from the nearby Silliman University approached the people of tiny Apo Island. They convinced them that it would be in their best interests to protect a portion of their reef as a marine sanctuary.
So para ma-maintain ang seawater, munangga organize sila og coastal and sila pero na stop sila kay tungod ang guidelines wala pa man.
The sanctuary is extremely small, about half a kilometre in length. Even so, with no destructive fishing, the reef is flourishing. Gary Russ is monitoring a steady rise in fish numbers. A school of large trevally patrols the reef edge, apparently aware of the safe haven. Fish now spilling out of the reserve have boosted the whole island's fish catches.
It's not just a small-scale thing because not only do fish move outside the reserves and help the yields close by, but fish produce a larval phase which disperses tens to hundreds of kilometres, so that these small reserves can act as sinks, if you like, to protect the spawning stock biomass and maintain fisheries over a much wider area. Hopefully, in years to come, I would envision, and other people like Dr. Alcala would envision, a network of marine reserves all over the country.
Coral reefs are the ultimate travellers. Ecosystems that wander in time and space and respect no international borders. Our efforts to protect them need to spread as far and wide as they do. The Sinai is a baking dish landscape under a baking dish sky, a land of roasted mountains and searing sands. Then, like a biblical miracle, the desert stops and the Red Sea bursts into life. For millennia, the Red Sea has washed over its own hidden corner of the coral realm. But with one of the world's greatest unspoiled coral kingdoms, now within 5 hours flying time of Europe, the jewels of the deep have come face to face with an explosion of tourists.
When we get to 100 bar, we'll ascend shallower. Okay? Please don't take anything out of the water that you didn't take in with you. And don't take anything into the water that you're not going to bring out with you.
Such as cameras and that.
Such as cameras, yeah. Don't drop your camera again.
Last year alone, 800,000 foreigners descended from the heavens. Most to dive the deep blue yonder. The Sinai has become Mecca for the underwater tourist.
6 years ago there was 10 boats operating in the area. Now we have 120 boats operating in the area. Next year we'll have 240 boats operating in the area. The same like the numbers of beds. 10 years ago there was 3 hotels here. Now we have 19 hotels working in the area.
In an attempt to control this tide of development, Egypt has declared nearly half the Gulf of Aqaba a multiple-use national park, along similar principles to the Great Barrier Reef. Because the reef here grows as a thin fringe right at the edge of the desert, they've extended the park concept to include much of the terrestrial landscape as well. In many ways, the task of protection is made easy here. Seasonal Bedouin fishermen are the only people with a claim to the shoreline. And they're just as interested in protecting this rare resource. Money is the driving force here. Without 50-50 financial support from the European community, protection would remain simply a nice idea.
From the European community we're getting support because they look after this place as one of World Heritage places. From the Egyptian government because they have pride in doing this, in keeping a treasure like this because it's very rich place. And of course from the economic part that it's generating tourism for the country.
Mga kaibigan, tayo ay umawit at magbigay galang. Lahat nating panahon, bating malukot at pasalubong.
Sheer natural beauty is a very effective bait for separating international tourists from their valuable foreign currency.
Magpakailan pa man, nang dito sa atin ay mawiling tunay at di na malimot panggalusyan mga.
During the 1980s, Baku Bay on the Philippines island of Palawan became host to 2 new industries, tourism and timber. When logging operations commenced in the watershed, there was a rapid increase in soil erosion. Mud poured into the bay and onto the reefs, cutting down the light needed for photosynthesis. On economic grounds alone, it was predicted that if logging was banned and the water left clean and clear, revenue from tourism and fish would leave the country $41 million better off over a 10-year period, with both reef and forest remaining intact.
When I came in, I recommended to the President that these timber license agreements be suspended from operating. And until now, they are not operating. One has already surrendered to us, and two will not be given any permit to cut. This is the result of our conviction that the island of Palawan is a very fragile ecosystem.
Today, the waters of Baku Bay are a declared protected area. This makes both economic and environmental sense. But as more and more reefs that are more and more remote are targeted in the search for that pristine dive spot, less and less of the undisturbed underwater wilderness remains. The speed with which coral coastlines are being developed could easily race away from our ability to protect them. Even here, on the Great Barrier Reef, the sanctuary granted for so long by size and distance has become a playground. Tourism is growing at 10% per year. Up to 300 people visit this small outer barrier reef each day. The only land is artificial, and permits for pontoons are strictly controlled.
It's a very good plan in that you don't get to move your pontoon. If you wreck an area, that's your bad luck, you're out of business. And so it's on the owner's best interest to look after their site, and they do.
Okay, well here we've got a beautiful specimen of a mushroom coral. A very unique type of coral, as you can all see.
The Quicksilver operation goes one better than most. Not only does it employ marine biologists to do the tour guiding, but these biologists have formed their own research arm.
We're able, because we're here all the time, to monitor almost continually and then to actually act on the results that we find fairly early. So it's very proactive in that way.
But despite the establishment of marine parks, monitoring is showing that worldwide, coral is under stress. And this can impact severely on the health of a reef. In Florida, the high rate of death and disease is a measure of a high degree of stress. And according to Brian LaPointe, it's coming from farms and cities on the coast.
For example, Lou Key off Big Pine Key, where I have worked for the past 12 years with Harbor Branch, it's lost 45% of its corals since 1984. This is not due to anchor damage or people stepping on the coral. It's due to diseases, coral bleaching, and other problems that we believe are linked to the nutrient buildup and eutrophication problem.
Feed too many nutrients onto a reef, and the nutrients feed algae. The algae grow over the corals. Your coral reef becomes a pile of rock covered in seaweed. Any number of things could be conspiring to cause the collapse of these reefs in the lower Keys. Sewage from urban populations, contaminated groundwater, the draining of the Everglades, or silt and fertilizer runoff from as far away as the Mississippi.
The loss is unfathomable. The fisheries will decline. Any pharmaceutical breakthroughs that may have been harvested, you know, or living in coral reefs have disappeared. Then the geology of this area is going to begin to erode. The reefs will begin to erode in time. The algae is not going to keep it glued together.
Coral coastlines the world over could be facing the same nutrient problem. In 1928, Low Isles in North Queensland became home to the scientists of the Great Barrier Reef expedition. Nearly 70 years later, their water samples are being matched with samples taken at the identical locations. Researcher Ibrahim El-Metri is finding an increase in both nutrients and microscopic algae carried in the water.
I believe it's a high development along the coast of North Queensland due to agriculture, urban, industrial, tourist development, and it's due to high nutrients.
Phosphorus and nitrogen are now washing from the mainland at a rate 4 times greater than when James Cook sailed past in 1770. The situation in Australia has not yet reached the crisis point of Florida, but there is evidence that nutrients are affecting the basic structure of coral.
What seems to be happening in previous experiments is that you get a change in the structure of the skeleton, and so the coral isn't as strong and robust. And one of the fears we have is that if that is a major response to elevated nutrients, then in fact we might be growing a whole series of corals that are very fragile. The system may appear to be going very well, but suddenly, when even natural cyclonic disturbance comes through, the whole reef system may in fact tend to crumble more than it does at present.
Reefs have crumbled in the past. This coral is a fossil. It grew in this spot, a fossilized reef terrace on the Sinai Peninsula about 200,000 years ago. Like their living Australian counterparts, the fossils here contain fluorescing bands of humic acid from rotting vegetation. This humic acid was washed from the land and deposited during ancient summer monsoons. Only in those corals alive today are the bands absent. Proof that the Sinai was much wetter and greener in the not-so-distant past. If corals have monitored climate change before, perhaps they're monitoring it now. In Tahiti, a rise in water temperature of only a few degrees was all it took for corals to eject their algal tenants. Is such coral bleaching normal, or is it evidence of greater climatic disturbance? The answer is probably here, locked away in coral cores in the basement of the Australian Institute of Marine Science. Awaiting full analysis is a comprehensive climate record for tropical Australia that dates back at least to the Middle Ages. This is not only a record of changes in the weather, it's a record of temperature as well. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in the Porites skeleton depends upon the temperature of the surrounding seawater at the time of deposition. This is a tropical thermometer.
Looks like a high reading there.
Geochemist Mike Gagan is finding he can read it to an accuracy of 1/4 degree for every week that a coral has lived in the sea.
And I think what we need to recognize is that massive corals are just as important as Huon pines for tree ring research, or bristlecone pines in North America, these 4,000-year-old warehouses of climate data. We need to save them. Perhaps they're monitoring global warming or monitoring pollution processes. We need to make sure those records are available.
2 decades of science and protection have left the Great Barrier Reef well placed to confront the challenges of the new millennium. The legacy of battles with the crown of thorns starfish is a comprehensive monitoring program. Each year, researchers from the Australian Institute of Marine Science survey 110 reefs. They look for changes in water quality, in populations of fish or crown of thorns, and changes in the cover of living coral. These may be early warnings of a reef out of balance. There is nothing static about a coral reef, just as there is nothing static about a human city. A healthy reef will bounce back from a physical assault as it bounces back from a storm. It's a constant background of stress that will push reefs to the limit.
Small species, non-juvenile, I think.
Thank you. Whether or not the reefs would still have the same fishes on them in 50 million years, I don't know. We've done horrendous things to reefs, especially in the last few decades, but they seem to have survived. They are, as structures, more resilient than perhaps we give them credit for, and perhaps we also overestimate our ability to damage them. In geological time, the problem is that we live in ecological timescales. We can destroy them for ourselves. We may not destroy them in the geological time frame.
Like other environments around the globe, coral reefs are facing the human squeeze. As we put the pressure on, reefs that may appear outwardly healthy to us could be waiting for that one last misfortune, be it a cyclone, a low tide, or a plague of starfish, that pushes them beyond recovery. The fossil record shows that when bad times come, coral cities can close down and disappear into the geological past. If bad times are allowed to spread to too much of the coral kingdom, these complex expressions of life will have nowhere else to drift.